Hello, welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of absolutism on the rise in France, right? And we left off in all of our classes talking about this guy, right? Talking about this dude, none other than the man. Hey, quit licking. Hey, stop licking. You're gonna lick yourself into having a bruise or something. Be nice to yourself. Sorry about that, y'all. I got a dog that just will not stop licking a little itchy spot. So the big thing about it, though, is, stop it, Josie. So going into it, though, we left off talking about this dude, right? Very, very important figure in the growth of absolute power inside of France, none other than Cardinal Richelieu, right? His red eminence, right? His red eminence actually referring to the fact that he wore cardinal red wherever he went. Now, we talked about how he's going to be the guy that comes in and becomes basically the ruler of France in essence, right? He's like the guy behind the scenes, right? Mastering everything, the puppet master at work. Whenever Louis XIII, his very, very weak king at the time, really wasn't being able to focus on the goings-on of the country and was much more focused on trying to have a child with his wife, Anne of Austria, right? And they focus on it, they try, they just keep having miscarriage after miscarriage. And he also ends up with a big feud with the king's mom, Marie de Medici, and stuff like that. He thinks that she's actually like a total buffoon and stuff like that. But going into it, what we need to understand about Cardinal Richelieu, though, is he's going to be the guy that's going to lead France during that time period when Louis XIII is on the throne, right? He is the chief minister of France, and he tried to do a lot of intense stuff. And as you can tell, looking at it right here, he's a very, very aggressive figure. It's one of my favorite paintings I've ever seen in history. It's just Cardinal Richelieu just sitting there, standing off in the actual, on the shores of La Rochelle, watching the French military go at it with the English military, right? Or the English Navy. Now, the thing that we need to understand, though, about it is that Cardinal Richelieu, being an aggressive Catholic, is going to do a lot of intense stuff that's going to be, one, self-serving to him, but then also self-serving to the crown, okay? So going into it, we need to understand he's going to try to destroy Huguenot nobles, right? At that siege painting that you saw right there, that city is called La Rochelle, which is a very famous Huguenot city that is going to establish itself after the Edict of Nantes when Henry IV, aka Henry the Great, Louis XIII's dad, actually passed that Edict of Nantes. La Rochelle became a Protestant city. Well, he didn't like that. Cardinal Richelieu didn't like that. So he's actually going to try and find ways to actually go after them, and he sieges them in several different attempts, and as you can tell, he did not mind attacking Huguenots at all. Now, because of motives like this, it's going to earn Cardinal Richelieu a little bit of a bad rap, right? In the sense of people are going to want to see him dead. So the thing is it's going to happen many, many different times. People are going to try to assassinate him, right? While Louis XIII is focused on having kids and developing a family and having an heir to the throne, he's going to actually have attempts on his life. Cardinal Richelieu is. It's pretty ironic when you think about it, because 9 times out of 10, when you think about murdering somebody in the royal court, you usually try to do that to the king, but everybody was trying to kill this Catholic minister, right? And the reason why is because he was the one really kind of truly running things in the big house, right? So there were spies inside the noble courts that he would actually use to foil assassination attempts before they ever even got to him, right? And he led France during the 30 Years' War as well. Now, you don't know a lot about the 30 Years' War right now. We might be able to talk about it a little bit going forward, but when you teach a European history class or when you talk about European history, you 9 times out of 10 end up talking about this huge war that went down called the 30 Years' War, right? And the 30 Years' War is a war that raged inside of Europe from 1618 to 1648, which is going to rip Europe apart. It's going to be the massive climactic battle between Protestant forces and Catholic forces. It's going to be have 4 huge phases to it. It's going to see the death of 3 million people from pestilence and war and starvation and stuff like that. And he actually enters into this war because he hates one family, the Habsburgs, right? He hates the Habsburgs with a fury because he doesn't think that Louis XIII, the weak king that he's actually ruling for, is doing enough about these people. And the Habsburgs actually control not 1, but 2 areas on the map that are actually surrounding France, right? They control the Holy Roman Empire because remember, Charles V split his family in half. Well, the split is the Austrian branch that controls the Holy Roman Empire, which is to France's east, and then the Spanish branch, which is to France's southwest, okay? And so France was surrounded by multiple Habsburg forces. Well, whenever he comes in, he decides that he wants to take them down, which is super ironic because the Habsburgs are also super Catholic, and that was just showing us that the 30 Years' War had become very political not as religious, right? So the other thing that we need to understand about him, though, more than anything else, is this thing that he created known as the intendant system, right? So when he created the intendant system, this is going to be the foundation for absolutism going forward. So the guy that actually comes along and actually becomes the supreme absolutist of France is a man by the name of Louis XIV, right? The son of Louis XIII. Spoiler alert, Louis XIII does end up having a child, right? After those several failed miscarriages and stuff like that. But the only reason that he was able to rule with so much power and dominance is because of the intendant system that Cardinal Richelieu set up. So what is the intendant system, though, Mr. Terry? That's a great question. Let me go ahead and tell you. The intendant system is this thing, all right, that was actually created by Cardinal Richelieu to try and supplant the power of another lawmaking body in France. So you have to understand, before Cardinal Richelieu came along, there were these things inside of these different districts of France. Kind of like we have states in the United States of America. France had several different districts. And these different districts, I think there was 18 of them in total. I'll have to go back and check that number. Each of them had this thing known as a Parlement. All right, so yeah, Parlement, spelled P-A-R-L-E-M-E-N-T, okay? Well, the Parlements, all right, which sounds deceptively a lot like parliaments. I know it's really frustrating because there's the Parliament in England that we spent a long time talking about, and now we're talking about the Parlements in France. Well, the Parlements in France are these things that actually wrote things into law, right? So if the king actually wanted to pass a law, he would send it out to the Parlements, and the Parlements would actually write it down for him and then send it out to the different districts of France, effectively creating a law. Now, the thing about it, though, is that means that these parlements, which are mostly inhabited by nobles and aristocrats, have a little bit of power over the king in and of itself, because they can just choose not to write it down. If they think that they don't like it, or if they think it's going to actually encumber them, they'll just refuse to do it, right? So this means that absolutists in France, before this new system, weren't true absolutists, right? So what's going to happen, though, is Cardinal Richelieu will create this thing known as the intendant system. In the fury of the 30 Years' War, he thought that messages weren't being delivered fast enough, and he thought the parlements were just slowing things down, right? So he created intendants, right? Or actually in French, it's called the intendants, right? So like now, and what they did is it's actually specific representatives of the crown that went into those 18 districts, and instead of going to the parlements, the king would just tell the intendants, and the intendants would go over the parlements' power, go straight to the people of France and enforce that law, right? Because the thing about it is technology is now grown enough to where literally the king doesn't need the parlements anymore, right? So now with the intendants, you have the foundation for an absolutist. Because now with these new elected officials, the royals can just say, go and do this, and the intendants will carry it out. It's a part of that ABCs of absolutism, right? That bureaucracy level. That right there is the bureaucracy of the French kings now, right? And so that means that this chubby little glowworm right here that Louis XIII is finally going to father is going to become the first absolutist of France, right? That little boy right there was born to Louis XIII and his wife Anne of Austria while Cardinal Richelieu was ruling, right? And his name is going to be Louis Dieudonné. So yeah, now look, really some of you are probably like, why there's so many Louis? Because they like that name, leave them alone. It all goes back to Clovis in the Middle Ages, right? Remember Clovis was the first king of France, and if you take his name and drop the C and turn the B into an I, you got the name Louis, right? So like now, Louis, though, is going to be Louis Dieudonné, and Louis Dieudonné right there actually means the gift of God, because everybody was like, okay, we just keep having failed pregnancies and stuff like that. He would eventually grow, and like when he was 4 years old, he was going to become king because his father died, right? Because Louis XIII died actually a few months after Cardinal Richelieu himself ends up perishing, right? So Louis XIV, though, was only 4 years old, obviously not old enough to rule by himself. Who's going to rule for him? None other than his mother, Anne of Austria, right? And another chief minister, another cardinal by the name of Cardinal Mazarin, right? Now, interesting little fact, though, Queen Regent of Louis XIII was Marie de Medici, and Chief Minister was Cardinal Richelieu. In that power dynamic, Cardinal Richelieu did all the ruling. Now, interesting little dynamic here, Anne of Austria and Cardinal Mazarin. Anne of Austria was kind of the one pulling the strings in that whole relationship. Also, word on the street is that her and Cardinal Mazarin might have been hooking up after Louis XIII died, right? But no one knows for sure. So going into it, though, you have to understand, Louis XIV, though, as a young boy, comes to power at the age of 4. Well, this is going to cause a lot of chaos in France. The nobles try to take a lot of power back because the intendant system has stripped the parlements of a lot of power. They wage war on the king itself. It's basically a small civil war. But what ends up happening in the long run is Louis survives, right? Louis survives that war, but he grows even further, and when he's around the age of 13 or 14, when he's becoming obsessed with his one passion in life, ballet. He's a trained ballet dancer, y'all. He's obsessed with his legs. He thought that they were super strong and powerful because of all of his dancing abilities. He's not a ballerina. He's a ballerino, because that's what you call a male ballerina. So yeah, now, but the thing about it, though, is By the time he hits about this age in his teens, he feels as though he can't trust the nobles anymore. And he doesn't even realize the power that he has, right? And this right here is a famous painting of him actually playing Apollo as one of his favorite characters to play in a lot of his different, ballets, right? And so Louis Dieudonné, though, is going to then become, one day, Louis XIV. Also known as the Sun King, because one day when he was inside of his palace, he was performing a ballet like as Apollo, right? And the light from the stage was lighting up the faces of the nobles who were adoringly watching him in all of his greatness and power dance during this play. And he was like, wow, I am the light for my people. This man is so arrogant, and he loved his legs with a fury and a passion because he would put them in every single one of his portraits, but he grows up to become known as the Sun King, right? Who is such a famous figure that literally places like things like in New Girl, right? With like what's her face? Zooey Deschanel, that great show that has Schmidt in it and stuff like that, even makes references to him. Like, check this out.
To grovel, I hate groveling. I would have lasted 2 seconds in the court of the Sun King. I think about that all the time.
You do?
Do you know how much I grovel on a daily basis?
Exactly. You wouldn't last a day in the court of the Sun King, right? So we need to understand, though, he is an absolute ruler at its best. And you can see his absolute authority in particular in a thing that he built when he was a very young man. Starting in the late 1600s, when he was literally only still in his teens, they decide that he hates the nobles now so much that he needs to separate himself from them. So he actually moves out of Paris, which is bananas to actually move out of your capital city, to his own palace now. A palace that is now known famously as the Palace of Versailles, right? The Palace of Versailles that's built 13 miles outside of Paris, which is actually a very far distance, about a 6-hour walk, give or take. And why does he do this? To separate himself from the people of Paris so he can rule absolutely outside in the outskirts of Paris. This building, y'all, right here, which goes from here to there, to there, to there, to there, to there, to there, is a massive complex that has over 700 different rooms, 1,200 fireplaces, over 2,000 pieces of furniture that most of them have gold on them. And then also, look at these fountains right here. The fountains are like literally the size of football fields. They're 100 yards long. Some of y'all are like, there's no way they're that big. Y'all, that right there is that right there, where'd you go? That's a person. Now look at the fountain, right? So yeah, the fountains are huge. They're literally the size of football fields, right? The gardens are huge. It covers several hundred square acres. So also what you need to understand as well, the palace was so big that literally the king himself would have to eat his dinner cold every night because it took that long to get the meal from the kitchen to him, right? And so this thing, if you walk from one wing to the other, it's a third of a mile. And it's got 3 different floors. So you end up, if you walk the complex, you walk a mile just indoors, right? Which is absolutely bananas. That right there is the Golden Gate to actually get inside of the palace itself. That's the second one. It's not even the first one. The first one actually got ripped down by a bunch of angry women during the French Revolution, which we'll talk about that a little bit later on. These are the emblems of the Sun King that are actually on that gate outside. This right here is the Cour du Mob, which is actually where all the nobles would roll up in their carriages on top of Italian marble floors and literally be greeted by this gigantic piece of architecture, right? By the way, the style of this architecture is known as Baroque architecture, right? Because Baroque is supposed to be the highest of the high end of things at the time. It's the Catholic Church coming back ever since the Protestant Reformation. And it also is supposed to like be a triumphant peak in all of our artistic things, right? Like you can't just do a thing of angels. You got to do the angels at their biggest moment, right? And so like I also think that Baroque architecture is so funny because it's actually referenced in Beauty and the Beast. Check this out.
And as I always say, if it's not Baroque, don't fix it.
If it's not Baroque, don't fix it. Now, going into it, though, also, this is his bedroom right there, which is it's insane. That's the Queen's bedroom right there. And this place, that right there, though, is where he loved to have his parties. It's known as the Hall of Mirrors. It's got over 300 different mirrors inside of it. They had to lure Venetians away from Italy to make the mirrors for them. And it could fit 2,000 people inside of it. It's where he loved to have his parties, right? And that right there is the Jardins of Versailles, the Gardens of Versailles, right? This massive complex, though, represents his absolute power. But politically speaking, how did this man pull this whole thing off? Well, let's go ahead and watch this real quick, and I'll see y'all soon when I'm back in class, all right? Y'all check this out. Louis XIV is a very, very serious thing, right? First and foremost, he did what is known as ruled from home, right? The Palace of Versailles was the centralized location of his throne, his energy, and also of his absolute reign that occurred in France, right? The eminence himself, well, not the eminence, the red eminence is Cardinal Richelieu, as we know. The Sun King himself ruled completely from the halls of the Palace of Versailles and the establishment of this thing known as his royal court, right? His royal court, of course, okay, when you're talking about court and court life, royal courts is basically the large group of nobles that he would keep basically begging at his feet, right? So a big thing about it in general is court or court life has to do going back to the Renaissance era and how nobles and rich, wealthy people would do what's known as hold court, right? Holding court, of course, referring to the idea of people coming to a rich person's home to see them, to party with them, to hang out with music playing in the background, dancing, drinking, and revelry of a sort, right? So the big thing about it, though, is that we talked about this in the Renaissance, right? We talked about Balthasar Castiglione writing the courtier, which is, of course, is a big thing about, like, being a courtier. It means you're somebody who can advise a king because you're a part of his court, right? Well, the royal court that Louis XIV constructed inside the Palace of Versailles is actually a massive council of princes and nobles that carried out all of his policies while he lived at his house, right? So he had the ability to talk to all these different princes and nobles that actually lived at his house with him for at least 30% of the year, right? Now, I don't mean that for, like, 2/3 of the year that there was nobody else in there with him. I meant that they were rotating through constantly, right? So there were these nobles that lived at his home with him, right? So if we look at this picture of him right here as well, that right there, of course, is Louis XIV. And look at the cavalcade of nobles that are actually on the stairs watching him address this other noble that is coming before him, who happens to be a sword noble, right? So something that you need to understand as well about the growth of French society is that there are two types of noble that existed in France, right? This all actually started with Henry IV, Louis XIV's grandfather, and they actually are what's known as sword nobles and robe nobles, right? Now, sword nobles are former members of the military or nobility that had earned their right, prestige, tradition, honor, and hereditary lands through military service, right? Going back sometimes generations. So we'll talk about one very famous sword noble a little bit later on, a man by the known as the Marquis de Lafayette, which of course the city of Lafayette is of course named after him, right? Now, interesting fact is it was originally known as Vermilionville. Now, going into it though, that sword noble, as you see bowing before the king, they are ones that actually earned those rights through military prestige. They were also the only people in French society that were allowed to carry an open weapon, of course being a sword, that they were allowed to actually carry around with them. Now, a big thing about it, though, is Louis did not particularly like the sword nobles, right? Because those are the people that led the Fronde rebellions against him when he was a very, very young man. He instead actually sold more rights of robe nobility to more people, okay? So what do I mean by selling? That's what makes a robe noble. You could buy your way into the nobility, and when you did buy your way into the nobility, you got a break from taxes, you didn't have to pay nearly as much as in taxes, and you got hereditary rights and lands, right? And so with that, when you bought your way into the nobility, you could actually be there under his thumb, right? Robe nobles would do anything they could to be closer to Louis, to suck up to him, right? So, for example, one of the best jobs you could have as a robe noble is helping him pick out the shirt that he was going to wear, either going to bed or waking up in the morning. Literally, people would stand near his bed, and when he woke in the morning, they would just, clap for him. Clap for him and be like, you're just the best. Look at you waking up. You're the best. Oh, my God. They also, apparently, one of the best jobs as well was helping him go to the bathroom or helping him eat or take off his riding boots in the evenings. Literally, the guy would come down the stairs and people would clap for him. Those were the robe nobles that lived at his royal court that would do his bidding and carry out all of his policies, right? Now, another big thing that you need to understand about Louis XIV is he was an uber Catholic, right? Now, as in uber, as in very extreme. Now, the big thing about it, though, is like, as a very, very strong Catholic, he greatly disliked Huguenots, even though, ironically enough, his grandfather was one. The big thing about it, though, is he actually destroyed Huguenot churches, schools, and tried to force conversion, causing a huge amount of Huguenots to actually leave the country of France and run away. He also is going to do something very, very big and important. He is going to revoke the Edict of Nantes, right? The Edict of Nantes, the document that said that Huguenots were allowed to practice freely inside of France is going to be revoked by Louis XIV, even though, again, his grandfather is the one that brought it into power, of course, Henry IV, i.e. Henry the Great, right? So going into it, though, as well, his royal court that existed from him within Versailles is very, very important. And it's basically the epitome of why, or the epitome of why, Louis XIV is considered the absolutist, right? He would force robe nobles to come and watch his ballets. He would force robe nobles to enact his policies. He would use the intendants set up by Cardinal Richelieu to enforce any kind of jurisdictional idea that he wanted to do. Now, how was he able to pay for all this, though, right? So we got to talk about his finances. So the biggest thing that you need to understand about Louis XIV is he spent basically the entire French budget on his palaces and funding his royal court. Also, he's going to adopt mercantilism, right? Now, mercantilism is very, very important. First of all, it was established by his advisor, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Now, the big thing about it, though, is mercantilism is that key concept of exporting more than you import and hoarding as much money as possible inside of your own country. So Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his financial advisor and robe noble himself, came up to Louis XIV and said, you have to understand that as Spain grows in liquidity and as they bring in more gold and silver into their borders, as every other country in this area begins to colonize and make more money, we need to do our best effort to try and hold on to as much gold and silver inside of this country as possible. And we need to try and do that by refusing to actually bring in foreign items. We need to actually export more than we import, because if you are exporting, you are receiving payment for an item, whereas if you are importing, you are paying for something. And if I spend $1 and it goes to England, it's going to get melted down and turned into a pound sterling rather than being a franc, right? So the idea, though, that was propagated to him was conserve and hoard as much money inside of the country as possible. That means he's going to increase tariffs, and a big thing as well that's going to happen under Louis XIV is the outlawing of certain foreign products, right? For example, write this down, Louis outlawed English tobacco. He also outlawed English cotton textiles, right? Because he was trying to force French people to buy products from France to keep that money hoarded inside of his country, right? So mercantilism is a big thing that he adopted that is going to be very, very big in the adoption and the understanding of Louis XIV going forward. He's also eventually going to die at the ripe old age of his 70s with a tremendous amount of debt, right? Having multiple different wives and things like that. But the big thing, not at the same time, but the big thing about it in general is he died mostly with a lot of debt due to the fact that he started more wars than you can imagine. And he was in power for 54 years. 54 years of reign, right? Now, in his 54 years of reign, though, he literally was at war for 33 of them, right? That is absolutely bananas. That's absolutely crazy. The idea that a guy that ruled into his 70s, that died in 1715, literally had that much time and power to lead many different wars. But the problem is he lost a couple on the back end, right? One of the biggest ones he, of course, lost on the back end was this thing called the War of Spanish Succession. Do y'all remember King Carlos II, the ugly Habsburg guy that was the last Habsburg of Spain? When he died, it left an opening on the throne. The person that ended up getting the throne is Louis's grandson, Philip V, right? And so the big thing about it is Louis tried to exert his power, try to grow his holdings, try to gobble up as much land and territory in Spain as possible. The rest of Europe coalesced together, fought against him, and crushed his forces, right? This is going to leave him with a tremendous amount of debt going forward. That's going to help lead into that French Revolution. But now what we're going to do is we're going to take a break right here, and we're going to talk about Russia, okay? So go ahead and give me a nice big title, a nice big fat Russia in your notes, so we can talk about this stuff